On the morning of 25 September 1997, around 10 o'clock, a car pulls up outside a Hamas office on a busy street in Amman, the Jordanian capital. Khaled Mashal steps out, walking toward the entrance. Later, he will tell interviewers that he felt a loud noise in my ear, like an electric shock. But in this frame, nothing has happened yet. Across the pavement, two men trail him at a casual distance. Their Canadian passports identify them as tourists staying at the Intercontinental Hotel. One of them carries a pre-shaken can of Coca-Cola, a detail later repeated in press reconstructions. An everyday object repurposed as camouflage for a toxic spray. The sunlight is ordinary, the traffic noise indifferent. Inside Jordan's royal palace, phones are already ringing over recent Hamas suicide bombings in Jerusalem. On the street, the can opens with a hiss. The real cost of that sound will not be borne by the man they are trying to kill alone. By late August '97, in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the images from the Mahana Yehuda market bombing of 30th of July and the Ben Yehuda Street bombing of 4th of September had already been archived into government files. Blown-out stalls, blood on cobblestones, forensic grids sketched over a fruit market and a pedestrian mall. In an Israeli cabinet room in Jerusalem, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu listened as security officials reviewed the toll. 21 dead in 2 attacks, hundreds wounded, Hamas claiming responsibility. An internal inquiry later summarized the decision plainly: a determination to act against terrorist targets. Among those targets was Khaled Mashal, Hamas's political bureau chief, then based in Amman. Seen in intelligence briefs as a central figure behind the campaign of suicide bombings. The method selected was meant to be clean and deniable. A fast-acting toxin delivered through the skin, leaving a death that could be described as natural. Several later accounts speak of a nerve agent. Others, including Jordanian doctors who would later treat Mashal, recognized the effects as those of a potent synthetic opioid, likely a fentanyl derivative. At the end of the meeting, phones were lifted, orders relayed. On paper, the operation was just another line in a counter-terror policy. For the people who would carry it out, it was the beginning of a life lived under someone else's name. Years later, the internal Israeli inquiry, known as the Kaya-Canover Report, would compress this entire turn in policy into a few paragraphs on what it called the Mishal Affair. On 24 September 1997, passengers stepped off flights from Athens, Rome, and Paris into the arrivals hall at Queen Aliyah International Airport, south of Amman. Among them were members of a Mossad Kidon unit, traveling separately, carrying European and Canadian passports. 2 men checked into the Intercontinental Hotel in Amman, using the names Sean Kendall, 28, and Barry Beads, 36, identities later confirmed by Jordanian and Canadian sources, and cited in press coverage about the abuse of Canadian passports. The names belonged to real Canadian Jews living in Israel, whose passport details had been appropriated without their knowledge. Their legend was simple: Canadian tourists on a short city break. According to one later account, they set out to see the city and avoided open contact with other members of the team, who stayed closer to the Israeli embassy compound. In Tel Aviv, Mossad director Danny Yatom had given them instructions he later summarized in memoirs and interviews. If the conditions on the ground differed from the plan, they were to abort. There would always be another opportunity. In the hotel room, the sounds of Amman filtered through the windows. Traffic, distant calls to prayer, the ordinary pulse of a Middle Eastern capital. One of the men picked up the bedside phone briefly to confirm a local contact number, then hung up. No one in the corridor could distinguish this call from any other guests. And that was the point. In subsequent intelligence histories, this day appears as a footnote. The moment the hit team entered Jordan without being noticed, the city continued its rhythms, unaware of what had arrived. I need to reach about 6,000 words total, so I have about 5295 words left for 11 more chapters. That's about 480 words per remaining chapter. Let me continue with the story, sticking to documented facts. By mid-September 1997, Khalid Mashal had been living in Amman for several years, heading the Hamas political bureau. His presence in Jordan reflected a particular phase in the kingdom's politics. A peace treaty with Israel signed in 1994, but space still allowed for Hamas's offices in the capital. Most days, he traveled by car from his home to his office, accompanied by a driver and, at times, his children. One Jordanian and regional press account stressed how, on the morning of the eventual attack, 2 of his young children were in the back seat, an element that later critics in the Arab press called evidence of the operation's recklessness. Inside the Hamas office in Amman, ordinary bureaucratic life continued. Faxes, phones, visitors. Later profiles emphasized Mashal's charisma and calm speaking style. Israeli intelligence briefs depicted him as a hardliner who nonetheless understood political leverage. In these same weeks, King Hussein's palace was managing a delicate balance. Cooperation with Israel on security and deep domestic anger over Israeli settlement policy and Palestinian casualties. Hamas's presence in Amman was both an asset and a liability, a channel for monitoring the organization, and a source of friction with the Israeli government that had signed a peace treaty only 3 years earlier. At the office, phones rang with routine calls, logistics, meetings, press inquiries. In one sense, these were just the sounds of an organization at work. In another, they marked the last days before those same circuits would carry urgent calls about a rapidly failing heart rate. When later Jordanian timelines of that period were drawn up, they linked the market bombings in Jerusalem directly to Mashal's front door in Amman. On 24th of September 1997, the day before the attack, members of the Mossad team made trial runs near Mashal's office in Amman. Accounts based on Israeli sources describe how they visited the area multiple times, ready to act, but repeatedly deciding to abort when conditions did not match the plan, too many bystanders, unexpected movements, or the presence of children. Official documents do not spell out every aborted approach, but later narrative histories confirm that the team came several times to the target area before the actual attempt. From the point of view of the watchers, these were hours of ordinary city life. Traffic, shop fronts, people coming and going. Street vendors sold coffee and newspapers. Cars idled at intersections. From the point of view of the planners in Tel Aviv, each aborted approach was another entry in an operational log, another reminder that conditions in the field never perfectly match a plan drawn up in a secure room. On the Jordanian side, nothing yet registered. There were no alerts, no warnings on police radios. Jordanian intelligence, which had worked with Mossad on other matters under the framework of the peace treaty, had no indication that Israeli operatives were conducting surveillance of a Hamas leader in the capital. The only lines being drawn linked suicide bombings in Jerusalem to broader concerns about Hamas, not to an Israeli hit team already present in the city. In later reconstructions, these aborted runs read like near misses, each one an invisible decision not to kill on that particular morning. The patience required was part of the training, but patience in the field always carried its own cost. On 22nd September 1997, 3 days before the attack, King Hussein sent a message to Benjamin Netanyahu, relaying, according to one detailed later account, a Hamas proposal for a 30-year hudna, or truce. The letter was delivered by hand to a secret Mossad station at the Israeli embassy in Amman. The Israeli Prime Minister and Mossad Director Danny Yatom considered the offer, but, according to reconstructions based on interviews and Israeli sources, they decided to proceed with the assassination attempt anyway. In intelligence dossiers, Mashal was described as a preeminent figure behind attacks that had killed Israeli civilians. Supporters of the operation framed it as an act of self-defense. Critics within Israel and abroad saw it as a high-risk gamble that could destabilize relations with Jordan. The diplomatic stakes were significant. Jordan was one of only 2 Arab countries that had signed a peace treaty with Israel. King Hussein had invested personal credibility in the relationship, and his willingness to relay Hamas communications to Israel reflected a complex role as intermediary. Phones carried the response back across the Jordan River. The operation was still on. The men in Amman received no philosophical explanation, only confirmation that their mission remained unchanged. Whatever political possibility was contained in the king's letter was now bound up with a toxin in an assassin's kit. In later diplomatic histories, this quiet exchange, a letter on 22nd September, an attempt on 25th September, became a stark timeline, a truce proposal overtaken by a poison device. The decision to proceed despite the king's message would become, in retrospect, one of the operation's most consequential aspects. By the early hours of 25th September 1997, the Kidon team had a clear picture of Mashal's routine in Amman, built from days of observation. They knew the approximate time his car dropped him outside the Hamas office, around 10 in the morning, and the brief walk from curb to doorway. In parallel, Israeli intelligence assessments circulated in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv underlined why he had been singled out. His role in the political bureau, his backing of suicide attacks, his symbolic importance after the 1997 bombings. For Jordanian authorities, Mashal was both guest and problem. The kingdom's leadership was wary of Hamas's activities, but also cautious about appearing to serve Israeli interests too openly, given that a significant portion of Jordan's population was of Palestinian origin. The political calculus required constant calibration. In later interviews, Mashal recalled a general sense of danger in these years, but not a specific warning about that morning. He described his life in Amman as one of political work, not battlefield command, meetings, speeches, internal debates. In the Mossad's operational files, however, he was not a speechmaker, but a node. An address, a car, a daily time window, a security pattern. It was this reduction, from human being to predictable route, that made the operation seem, on paper, controllable. When the Israeli internal inquiry later reviewed what it called the Mishal affair, it noted how thoroughly his movements had been mapped, and how little that helped once the first second on the street went wrong. The gap between planning and execution would prove decisive. On 25 September 1997, the sun rose over Amman in the usual way. Haze over the hills, traffic building on main roads, office workers moving through the city. Around 9 in the morning, according to later accounts derived from Israeli and Jordanian sources, members of the hit team left the Intercontinental Hotel, blending into the flow of foreign visitors. The hotel, a familiar landmark in Amman, saw tourists and business people come and go daily. 2 more among them attracted no notice. They used rented civilian cars, ordinary models chosen to avoid attention, to position themselves around the approach to Mashal's office. The plan, as reconstructed in multiple press pieces and retrospective analyses, hinged on proximity and distraction. As Mashal stepped out of his car, one agent would open a pre-shaken can of Coca-Cola, creating a small diversion, while the other briefly pressed a device to his neck or left ear, delivering a dose of toxin through the skin. Some sources describe the device as a spray, others as a kind of injector. None provide public technical schematics. The details remain classified or speculative. All agree that, if undetected, the poison was designed to kill within hours, slowly enough to appear natural, quickly enough to be irreversible. In the hotel rooms now standing empty, the bedside phones were silent. Whatever doubts the operatives might have had were no longer visible. On the street, they moved like men following a script, about to discover how quickly real life overruns planning. In later news articles, this entire morning would be reduced to a phrase. 2 agents approached him on a street in Amman and sprayed poison into his ear. Shortly after 10 in the morning on 25th September 1997, Mashal's car stopped near the Hamas office in Amman. He stepped out and walked toward the doorway. The street was busy with the ordinary traffic of a weekday morning: pedestrians, vehicles, the sounds of commerce. 2 men closed in behind him. One raised the Coca-Cola can, the other moved in at his left side. In the confusion of that second, a device touched his left ear or the area just behind it. Some sources emphasize a fine spray, others an injection mechanism. Mashal felt something. Later, he described it in an interview as a loud noise in his ear, like a boom, like an electric shock. At first he thought it was a prank or some odd accident. The kind of strange moment that city life occasionally produces. But one of his guards or aides had seen more. The too close movement, the can, the quick withdrawal. Arab and international press accounts based on Jordanian sources describe how an aide shouted and gave chase, triggering a pursuit down the street. The 2 men began to run. In those first moments, the toxin was already seeping into Mashal's system, designed to shut down his nervous function within hours. On paper, this was the clean moment of execution, the culmination of weeks of planning, surveillance, and preparation. In reality, it was the instant when control began to unravel. The shout from the aide, the movement of pursuit. None of this had been anticipated. In international press coverage that autumn, the event would often be summarized in a single line. A Hamas leader attacked with a poison chemical on a street in Amman. The simplicity of that summary obscured the chaos that followed. As the device was pulled back, Mashal's bodyguard lunged toward the 2 men. On the Amman sidewalk, the supposed Canadian tourists turned and ran. They sprinted across a busy roadway. One stumbled. The chase, described in multiple newspaper accounts and later narrative histories, became a tangle of bodies, shouting and pursuit through the neighborhood. Bystanders joined in. Stones were thrown. The professional detachment of the operation had dissolved into a street scramble. Jordanian police responded quickly. Within a short time, they detained the 2 men whose passports identified them as Sean Kendall and Barry Beads, both Canadians. Initial checks by Canadian authorities revealed that the identities corresponded to real Canadian Jews living in Israel, whose passport details had been borrowed, a discovery that would later cause a diplomatic rift between Canada and Israel. The Canadian government expressed outrage at the abuse of its passports for an assassination attempt. Meanwhile, other members of the Mossad team retreated toward the Israeli embassy in Amman. Several made it inside and requested protection. Within hours, Jordanian security forces surrounded the compound. According to later Israeli and American accounts, King Hussein considered ordering an assault on the embassy if the team was not surrendered. Phones began to ring in Jerusalem, Amman, Ottawa, and Washington. What was meant to look like a sudden illness on a foreign street had become a very public crisis involving multiple governments and a peace process that suddenly seemed fragile. For the captured operatives, the operation's codename and planning details vanished behind a new label in Jordanian police files: attempted murder with a chemical weapon on Jordanian soil. The diplomatic consequences were only beginning to unfold. Within hours, on 25 September 1997, Mashal's condition began to deteriorate. He developed a severe headache, then vomiting, classic signs, Jordanian physicians later explained, of opioid poisoning at a high dose. He was taken to King Hussein Medical Center in Amman, where doctors struggled to stabilize him without knowing exactly what substance had been used. His vital signs grew increasingly alarming. In the royal palace, King Hussein was furious. In interviews later that year, he accused Netanyahu of betraying his trust most audaciously by dispatching Mossad assassins to kill a Hamas leader in the Jordanian capital, jeopardizing both domestic stability and the 1994 peace treaty. The king sent a clear message through multiple channels. If Mashal died, the two captured agents would face trial and possible execution, and the peace treaty might not survive. He communicated this both directly to Israel and through diplomatic channels to U.S. President Bill Clinton, whose intervention would soon prove decisive. The American president's involvement reflected the strategic importance Washington placed on the Israel-Jordan relationship. In Israel, Netanyahu confronted a narrowing set of options. He could deny involvement and risk the agents' lives in the treaty, or admit responsibility and provide the antidote. An internal crisis unfolded behind closed doors. On the record, what would appear was only the outcome: the decision to send help. Back in Amman, hospital phones carried urgent consultations. The doctors knew they were racing a toxin whose composition they did not fully understand. Blood pressure, respiration, consciousness, all were failing. The question hanging over each call was simple and brutal: would the antidote arrive in time? In later retellings, this day is remembered as the moment when a king threatened to storm an embassy, and when Israel had to save the life of the man it had just tried to kill. On 26 September 1997, as Mashal lay in a coma at King Hussein Medical Center in Amman, Israeli envoys moved quietly to deliver what Jordan was demanding: the antidote. Mossad officer Mishka Ben David, who had been in Amman as part of a medical backup team in case one of the Israeli operatives was accidentally poisoned, received a call in his hotel room. In interviews years later, he recalled being ordered to take the vial he carried to the hotel lobby, where a Jordanian intelligence officer would meet him. He did as instructed. In his telling, there were almost no words exchanged. He handed over the vial and, later, stood beside a Jordanian doctor as the antidote was injected into Mashal, following guidance that Israeli doctors had conveyed through diplomatic and intelligence channels. Jordanian medical staff observed what they had already suspected. The symptoms matched an opioid overdose, and the antidote, consistent with drugs used to reverse such effects, began to stabilize the patient. Mashal's vital signs slowly improved. For Ben David, as he later told journalists and interviewers, the moment was morally complex. He was helping save the life of a man his organization had just tried to kill. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. For the Jordanian doctors, the calculus was simpler: a critically ill patient, a potential treatment, a chance to prevent his death, and a political explosion. The work of medicine operated on its own terms. In the hours that followed, Mossad regained consciousness. The crisis had been contained, medically at least. In one retrospective summary, a former Mossad officer put it bluntly: Israel saved Mossad's life, not out of friendship, but to contain the fallout of a failed assassination. The diplomatic negotiations, however, were just beginning. In the days following 25 to 26 September 1997, while Mossad recovered at King Hussein Medical Center, negotiations unfolded between Amman, Jerusalem, and Washington. King Hussein insisted not only on the antidote, but on a broader political price. Under pressure from Jordan and the United States, Netanyahu agreed to a package that included the release of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the quadriplegic founder and spiritual leader of Hamas, along with dozens of other Palestinian prisoners. Israeli sources describe internal anger at this outcome. An operation meant to decapitate Hamas's leadership had instead freed one of its most symbolic figures. Critics within Israel argued that the mishandling of the operation had strengthened Hamas's prestige and undercut moderate Palestinian actors. The strategic calculus had inverted entirely. At the same time, the two captured agents were eventually returned to Israel, their lives spared as part of the same understandings that had provided the antidote. Other members of the team, who had taken refuge in the Israeli embassy, were allowed to leave as the immediate crisis cooled. The diplomatic machinery had found a resolution, but not without cost on all sides. Phones in the region carried new narratives. In Arab media, Mossad was now the man whom Israel could not kill. In parts of the Israeli press, Mossad's aura of infallibility had been punctured. The same devices that had relayed operational orders now bound together a story of failure and unintended consequences. In diplomatic chronologies of 1997, the Mossad affair appears as a hinge point. The episode after which Jordan tightened its control over Hamas, eventually closing its Amman offices, and Israel quietly reconsidered the risks of high-profile assassinations abroad. The clean operation had become a cautionary tale, studied in intelligence academies and foreign ministries alike. By 1999, Jordan had closed Hamas's Amman office and expelled Mossad, who moved first to the Gulf and later to Syria, before eventually basing himself in Qatar. The poisoning attempt that nearly killed him had become central to his public image. In interviews decades later, international outlets still introduced him as the man who survived a Mossad assassination plot. The event had transformed him from a political operative, known mainly in intelligence circles, into a figure of symbolic resistance. In Israel, the fallout continued quietly. The Mossad affair damaged Mossad's reputation, contributed to the eventual departure of director Danny Yatom, and became a case study in how operational overconfidence and political pressure could combine to produce a strategic setback. The Siashanover report examined the failures in detail, though much of its content remained classified. For Mishka Ben David, the former Mossad officer who had handed over the antidote, the episode marked a turning point. He left the service and later became a novelist and essayist, writing works that, while fictionalized, were haunted by questions of assassination, failure, and moral responsibility. In public interviews, he occasionally addressed the broader implications of intelligence work in a democracy. In 2013, Al Jazeera aired a documentary titled "Kill Him Silently: Mossad vs. Khaled Meshal," layering interviews, reenactments, and archive footage into a visual dossier of the events of 25 September 1997. The film's title captured the operation's ambition. Its existence attested to its failure. In one of the documentary's segments, archival recordings played over muted street scenes in Amman and Jerusalem. The ambient sounds, traffic, distant voices, the almost imperceptible ringing of a phone in a background office, carried the weight of what had transpired. Official histories tallied this operation as a fiasco narrowly contained. For the individuals involved, it remained a reminder that in the world of covert action, the line between hunter and savior could be crossed in a single phone call. The soft click of a receiver being placed back in its cradle. The end of one call among many that turned an operation of silent killing into an enduring, uncomfortable memory on all sides.